In this video, we're going to look more at plotting in R, and in particular, we're going to look at what is called ggplot. So as usual, I've got my script open. You'll notice down here I've got the folder open where I keep the script. For this script, we're not actually going to use an outside data set, so I'm not going to worry about setting my working directory. So I've got a couple notes here just to start us out. There are more sophisticated ways to create plots in R, and I alluded to this in the last video. And so one of the most common packages used is called the ggplot2 package, or ggplot. Usually people refer to it as. So you can read a little bit more about ggplot2 here. And then the ggplot2 package makes use of factors, and I mentioned factors in the last video as well. So I have a link here where you can read a little bit more about factors, but essentially factors are a variable in R which takes a limited number of different values, and they're often referred to as categorical variables. So we can think of factors as categorical variables. Factors in R are stored as a vector of integer values with a corresponding set of character values to use when the factor is displayed. Now, in order to use ggplot2 or to use ggplot, it is one of the core members of what is called the Tidyverse. So the Tidyverse essentially is just a big package that contains a lot of other packages in it, and these are all packages that are have this common philosophy of data and R programming. So you could just install the ggplot2 package, or you can install the Tidyverse package. Either way is going to allow you to do what we do in this video. I'm just going to go ahead and install the Tidyverse one, and because we're going to use some of the other functions in Tidyverse later on in the course. So just as a reminder, if there's a new package that you haven't used before, do remember to go up to Tools, Install Packages, and you're going to want to look for Tidyverse. So there's Tidyverse and click Install. I'm going to click No on mine. You want to click Yes on yours. The only reason I clicked No on mine is because I already have it installed. And then after it's installed, we do want to run the library function. And we see that it comes up. Now, notice on mine, it didn't have anything after it. In yours, it most likely will. And it will probably tell you some additional packages it installed, and one of those will be the ggplot2. Alright, so last video we looked at exploring the orange data set. We're going to talk about that some more. So let's just start out by reminding ourselves what was in the orange data set. If you'll remember, this was a data set that had 3 different variables. It had tree, which is an ordered factor, age, and circumference. And so now that we're going to be working in ggplot, I'd like to talk a little bit more about factors and how those are stored. So let's just remind ourselves by pulling up the orange data set, and in particular, let's look at the tree variable. Alright, so notice that in the data set, tree is stored as a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So initially we might look at this and think, oh, that's a number. Well, in this case, since it gives us the levels afterwards, and we actually looked at this last time and it tells us here that this is a factor, it's not actually stored as a number, it's stored as a character. And so to illustrate that, what I'm going to do just down here in the console is I'm going to call the orange tree variable, and let's just look at the first observation. Okay, we see that it comes up like this. So it's not just the number 1, it looks different than when we have called something before that is a numeric. And then let's also look at the second observation. And we see the second observation is also a 1. Now, if these were numbers, it would make sense to add them together. So let's see what happens if we try to add these two together. Notice we get this error, and again, that is because these are stored as a factor, which is a type of character. So do be careful here. Now previously when we looked at characters and we called them, we saw they had the quotations around them. The factors do not have those quotations, but they are really stored as characters. Now a lot of times when you work with factors, it won't be as confusing because instead of having numbers, it'll actually have some word that has meaning to it. So pretend they weren't orange trees, they were just trees in general. You might have like a sycamore and a walnut and a maple, actual names for those categorical variables. So just something to think about. And then again, we could always explore our data set. We could look at the first couple rows, and then we could also look at the structure. And again, we see here with tree that is an ordered factor. All right, the other thing I'd like you to notice, oh, actually, I'm going to take this line out. It won't be in yours. We're going to talk about tibbles later on in the course, so that won't be in your script that you open up. All right, so we're going to start out with the basics of ggplot. One of the nice things about ggplot is it has a common structure that it works with for all the different plots. Now, when you first see the structure, it's got a couple different pieces. It can be a little bit confusing, but once you understand the basic structure, manipulating ggplots really isn't that bad. So the first thing we're going to do is just start out by calling ggplot. Now, if we call ggplot, the first argument that we're going to put in here is the data set we're using. So we're going to use the orange data set. So for the argument data, we're going to set that equal to orange. And so let's run this. And notice here in my plotting window, nothing comes up. This is how you make an empty graph in ggplot. And you might say, well, why is that useful? And the reason it's useful is to have a conceptual understanding of how ggplot actually builds plots. So the easiest analogy I can come up with is, have you ever seen transparent sheets that can be laid on top of one another to build an image? That is essentially what ggplot is doing. The first sheet is just the white background, or really it's like a light gray background, but it's just a background. And then the next layer that's going to go on top, that's going to have something to do with the data, and then you can put another layer and another layer and another layer. So in ggplot, what you're doing is you're going to be setting layers down, and if you were to look down on top of all of those layers, you would see the completed plot. So the first layer that we need is just kind of that blank slate, and then we're going to add things on top of it. Now, each time that we want to go and add on a layer, we're going to use a plus sign. And so I've got an example here. So let me run this, and then we'll talk about what this layer is. All right, so notice now we've got something more that we're used to. Here is a plot. So we start out with the blank plot using the ggplot call, and notice there is a plus sign here, and that plus sign does need to be on the end. It can't go down to the next line. So that creates my empty layer. And next, my next layer, I want to add on my actual plots for my point. And so that is what the geom_point function is going to do. Now, the call here, geom_point, there are lots and lots of different geom functions. So the point one makes a scatter plot. There are other types that would create other types of plots. And so the naming convention here is all going to be very similar. Once you have the function, the geom function, you're always going to add inside of it what is called the mapping. So the mapping, what it's going to do is it is going to map what you're doing with your data to that type of plot. So here, mapping is going to equal AES, which stands for aesthetic, and we want the age to be the X and Y to be the circumference. And so I've made kind of a comment here to tell you basic plots and ggplot are always going to have three things. You're going to create the empty plot using this piece. You're going to create the layer with the points or the lines, and that's going to be controlled by which geom function you choose. And then you have to include the mapping. And so that is essentially going to connect back to the data and let R know what it is you actually want in this plot. So those are the three different pieces. So kind of I've got commented here a template for you. You're going to have geom_plot, data equals, and then here in the brackets you're going to fill in the name of your data. You're going to choose the appropriate geom function that you want, so that'll depend on what type of plot you want to make. And then the mapping, what you put in the aesthetic call, that's going to depend on what type of plot you're making. So for a scatter plot, for example, I have to give it the X and the Y. If you were making a histogram, X and Y wouldn't be appropriate. You would just give it the single variable. So that's going to change based on, what type of plot you're making. All right, so that's the basic. Those are the three basic pieces. So we're going to start talking about how can we add on to this? How can we make this more sophisticated? All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what are called aesthetic mappings. So this is that mapping piece we were talking about up here. So an aesthetic is a visual property of the object in your plot. So aesthetics include things like size, shape, or color of your points. So the first thing that I might want to do is to change the color of all of the points. So to do that, we include that in the we do not include that in the mapping. So notice this piece is the exact same as what I had up here. I've just added on color equals red. All right, and notice they have now all turned red. But we saw last time that really for this data set, it doesn't make sense to have all of the points be the same color. It makes more sense to have the points based on the tree type. So to do that, what we're really saying is we want color based on the value of a variable. When you want the characteristic to map to the value of a variable, that's when you're going to include it in the aesthetic mapping. Okay, so notice here I've got mapping equals, and inside of the aesthetic call I have x is equal to age, y is equal to circumference, and since I want the color to depend on the data, I've got color equal to tree. And so this is going to run. And notice the nice part about this is ggplot is automatically going to put in that legend for me. So previously when we looked at the base functions, we had to build that function and we saw we had to be really careful with that. Here, ggplot is going to automatically do that for me. We could also do size based on the value of a variable. So here's size. Now, one thing that I will say is make sure that whatever choice you're using here makes sense with the data. So for this one, color is a good way to separate from the trees. Here, even though this is an ordered factor, so we've ordered it by diameter of the diameter of the tree. Remember we saw that in our data set. Let me go back to that just as a reminder. Remember the ordering is according to increasing maximum diameter. And we can see here that the tree 3 has the smallest diameter and tree 4 has the largest. The problem with using this is it does make it look like those scale, and really the scale isn't meaningful here. So just kind of keep that in mind when you choose how to distinguish between different levels of a variable or a factor. Another option is you could use transparency. That's controlled by alpha. So notice here all of the points are the same size, but they're just on a different grayscale or a different transparency. Something like this could be really useful if you were publishing in black and white and not in color. But one thing to be careful about is notice that the lightest one, it is kind of hard to see. And then finally we could also use shape. And so here's different shapes. Now this time R is going to give you a warning because it's saying, hey, you really don't want to use shapes for something that's ordinal because shapes don't have an obvious order. And that is definitely true. So something to keep in mind. So how we choose to distinguish different levels of a factor in a data set, we do want to be cognizant of that when we choose, what characteristic we're going to use to distinguish those. So that is just kind of the basics of ggplot. We're going to look a lot more at ggplot in future videos, but I think conceptually wrapping your head just around those three different pieces of a ggplot and how to set those up can be kind of tricky. So that's why this video is a little bit shorter, but I do want you to play around with this and really, get that understanding of those three different pieces and what are just some of the basic things that we can do in these plots.